Good evening and thank you for watching. Hear now the word of the Lord from Job chapter 38, the first 11 verses. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it bursts out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Well, after 37 chapters of arguing and bickering and trying to figure it all out, God shows up. He shows up in a whirlwind. And this is a long time coming. You know, we often talk about having the patience of Job, but as you've read this book, I hope you notice that Job lost his patience way back at the end of chapter 2. Because beginning in chapter 3, Job begins using some pretty unnerving and forceful speech to challenge God. Show up, God, and fill us all in on why this bad stuff is happening to me. Why am I suffering? And why, when I look around at the state of the world, do I see so much suffering and violence and corruption? And so in chapter 38, God shows up. And he addresses Job with very much an attitude that says, Job, who do you think you are to challenge anything I created in the beginning? You know, many times in Scripture, God is portrayed as this cosmic architect who drew up the plans and opened the toolbox and got busy building the universe. But back in chapter 12, it was Job who says, God, as I look around at all the unjust suffering in the world, it seems that you didn't use any care at all in making these things. That you just kind of threw it all together and let the chips fall where they may. In chapter 24, we read Job's blistering language against God when he said, In this world the wicked succeed and the innocent suffer, the dying groan, the throat of the wounded cries for help, yet God pays no attention to their prayer. And Job's case in point, himself. God's not hearing my prayers. Look at what he says in Job chapter 9. If I summoned God and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. That's how Job feels. But he's wrong, isn't he? God is listening. And it's fitting that the Lord does answer from a tempest, a whirlwind. When you see a whirlwind in the Bible, it usually means God's about to show up, and he might be showing up in judgment. And so God shows up to Job in this fierce wind, but he hasn't come to crush Job. He's not come to judge Job. No, God only wants to forcefully disapprove of Job's accusations. Why? Well, first of all, they're unfounded. They're wrong. Job speaks what he thinks is true, but he speaks with incomplete knowledge. And secondly, the words of Job have done nothing but injure his relationship with the Lord. In his suffering, Job has become, according to verse 2, one who darkens counsel by words without knowledge. Words without knowledge. Speaking where we ought not speak because we just really don't know. Somebody asks me how to perform brain surgery, I'm going to keep quiet because I don't know anything about it at all. And folks, it is the same way for Job and for us when we start to talk about how God is and why he does what he does or doesn't do what we think he ought and to whom he does or does not do it. Now, we do have a broad history of people questioning God. You think about all those lament psalms that you've been reading along with your daily readings. Sometimes David says things to God that I never would say, things that would make me want to crawl under a table for fear of being struck by lightning. Israel has a long history of questioning God's behavior and then complaining about their own suffering. But it seems that Job has moved away from being a man who is of great integrity in the face of suffering to being a man who believes his integrity and his righteousness should actually shield him from any suffering. In chapter 31, verse 6, which you read earlier, Job said, "Let me be weighed in a just balance, and let God know my integrity." And then Job goes on to express himself very boldly, saying that his complaint before God is a just complaint, and if God would just show up, he would wear God's indictment against him like a crown. He says, "I would stand before God like a prince." Why? Because Job knows he's done nothing wrong. And then God does show up. But he doesn't spend any time addressing Job's complaint. Instead, the Lord begins here in chapter 38 by asking a series of rhetorical questions about Job's knowledge of God's mysteries and purposes and ways. God says, "Where did you come up with all this knowledge, Job? Sounds to me like you know everything." And these two speeches from God will run through the rest of the book, beginning here in chapter 38. Going all the way to the end of chapter 41. And these speeches are designed to expose Job's inadequate understanding of how God runs the universe. Here in chapter 38, the Lord specifically challenges Job's understanding of the architecture of the cosmos and the divine care of the creation. God alone knows where and how the foundations of the earth were laid. He alone knows the true scope of creation. God was careful, even meticulous, in his planning and measuring and building. In fact, creation is God's own temple, dedicated by the celebration of the morning stars and the shouts of the heavenly host of joy, according to verse 7. And then in the last few verses of our text for this evening, verses 8 through 11, God talks about his control of the tossing sea, the oceans. He paints a picture of himself as something of a divine midwife, and the sea as his newborn child bursting forth from the womb. And to keep this sea child from hurting itself and others, God lovingly swaddles the child and then gives the child limits on its boisterous behavior. Now, none of that addresses Job's accusations against God, does it? I mean, all of us want an answer to Job's question. Why do righteous people suffer, Lord? Tell us. Because we all experience suffering and pain. All of us will taste death. And so we want to know, God, why do children die of cancer? Why do the rich get richer in their greed? Why do church buses get hit by 18-wheelers and everybody on board gets killed? Why does this happen, God? And God says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the universe? How did I do it? How do I keep the oceans from consuming everything? I heard a preacher say just this week, and I wish I could remember who he cited as the original source. I can't remember. But I liked what he said. God is a mystery. Many things about God I do not know. I don't have to know. And I'm glad I don't have to know. It's a good attitude to have. Folks, we have to understand that there is this unbridgeable chasm between God's divine infinite knowledge and our finite human knowledge. At some point, we're just going to have to accept that God is sovereign. We're going to have to accept that his knowledge and power are beyond anything we can comprehend, and that's okay. In fact, it's probably something for which we should be thankful. Because to have just a thimble full of God's knowledge poured into our finite minds would probably first make us insane and then kill us. No, much more important than knowing the unknowable is having a relationship with the one who knows it all. That's a much deeper need, is it not? And by His grace, God allows us to know just enough about Him to have that relationship. Job needs to know that in the midst of his suffering, God has not abandoned him. God still cares for him. God still loves him. In fact, the Lord loves him so much that He pays him a visit from a whirlwind. And church, you and I have also received a visitation from God. His name is Jesus. And on His visit, He showed us what we need to know about God. He was the divine image of the Creator. And more than that, He shared in our sufferings by submitting Himself to death. And not just any death, but death on a cross. We don't get to see why good people suffer. But we do see Jesus, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of His death, so that by the grace of God, He might taste death for everyone. Church, we see Jesus, and seeing Him, it is enough. I pray that you will walk with Jesus this week, and I will see you in Zoom class Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. God bless.